I want you to watch this video before you even think about selling property with tenants in Ontario. There's a lot of things involved and things that you want to know to make sure you don't get into any legal trouble. My name's Daniel Hale. I'm a licensed real estate agent and I have sold a ton of tenanted properties. This one, a lot. I work with a lot of investors and I want to share with you the things that I have learned and what you need to know before you even consider getting started. Starting with the first thing, before you put the property on the market, tell the tenant it's going up for sale. Try to give them 1 to 2 weeks notice so that they are prepared. They can help get the house ready. They might be frustrated, so you want to let them know you don't want to just slap the for sale sign up, get started, and have an upset tenant. So the first thing is get the property on the market with the least amount of frustration possible amongst you and that tenant. Now the next thing, never let the tenant control the showing schedule. They cannot cancel anything. They cannot tell you when you're gonna show the property, what time you're gonna show the property, any of that stuff. That gives them complete control and takes all the control away from you, which is what you do not want. You tell them they're gonna get 24 hours notice from Monday to Sunday amongst the hours of 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. as per the Landlord and Tenant Board in Ontario. Now the next thing, which has gotten so many people in a ton of trouble. I've seen a lot of landlords lose a ton of sleep, have legal issues, lawsuits, absolute messes. Don't ever guarantee vacant possession upon a specific date. Ever. The truth is, the only person that can evict the tenant is the Landlord and Tenant Board. So if you tell the buyer you're going to give them vacant possession upon a specific date and the tenant doesn't vacate, there's nothing you can do about it, which sucks. So you want to make sure that you do not ever guarantee vacant possession on a specific date. And I'm going to talk to you guys a little later in this video how you can still accomplish this goal regardless of that scenario. Now the next thing to know, the lower the rent compared to the actual market value rent, the harder this is gonna be. Can you still get it done? Absolutely. Just hope that your tenant is on a month-to-month lease, not a fixed term lease. Because if they're on a fixed term lease, you have to let that tenant finish that lease before you can do any eviction for the buyer's personal use. If they're on a month-to-month lease, you can evict that tenant and you can get around this. However, I want you to understand and know the lower the rent, the higher probability that tenant's gonna give you a little bit more of a difficult time because they're not gonna wanna leave. They can't find that rent anywhere else. So make sure you're aware of this, but understand there are a lot of ways to get around this as long as you do this right. Which also means that the higher the rent in comparison to the market value rent, if you are at market value, then this is gonna be a lot easier because the tenant looks at this like, well, the landlord's selling, I'm paying market rent, I can get this rent anywhere. So they're not at a loss. The only loss they have is moving and time to move. But it's not a big deal. They usually will give you a lot less problems if they're at market value rent. Now, one of the biggest things landlords need to know is who can actually buy this property and what can they do when they buy the property. A lot of landlords think, oh, it's my property, I have the right to sell it. Trust me, I absolutely am with you on this and I wish that were true. But in Ontario, you have to sell it to a specific party. And if it is another party, then they must assume the tenant. Let me explain. If it is an investor, that investor must assume the tenancy. They cannot evict the tenant and rent it out for more or do whatever they want with the property. They have to assume that tenancy if they are an investor. Now, if they are buying the property for personal use, meaning they're purchasing the property, they're moving into that property, and they're going to stay for at least a period of up to 1 year. Then you have the right to issue an N12 notice of eviction and you can sell that property to that buyer and they can move in and you can evict the tenant. Now, if the tenant still denies this, doesn't want to move out and fights this, you still have to go to the landlord and tenant board hearing and get that eviction. But at least you know who you can sell the property to. One of the most important things when it comes to strategy and how you're positioning the sale of your house. Which leads me to the next thing, the agreement of purchase and sale. You must make sure the agreement of purchase and sale has all of the correct clauses in that agreement to keep you protected and help you avoid any lawsuits. Again, if you guarantee vacant possession with no extension clause in there in case the tenant doesn't leave, the buyer can sue you, you can get in a lot of trouble, and there's gonna be a lot of litigation and issues at closing. Or even worse, your deal dies and they don't buy the property, they back out. Well, I shouldn't say even worse, at least you don't get sued, but your deal is dead and you have to start all over again, and you just lost months and months and months of time trying to sell this property. I can't explain to you guys how many times I've seen this happen, and agents make mistakes, or landlords, when they sell the property because they don't know what they're doing. So make sure the correct clauses are in that agreement of purchase and sale in order to help you sell the house with zero litigation issues, and you can successfully get it done. Understanding your forms of what you can issue to the tenant. There's the N11, which is the notice to end the tenancy. It's an agreement between the landlord and the tenant that you guys are agreeing to end that tenancy upon a specific date. If this form comes into play, it usually happens because the tenant will say, hey, I would like to move out on this date. Can you at least give me this much time? And sometimes the landlord will agree to that and say, okay, we can do this, but only do it if they sign that N11, because if not, they're just kicking the ball down the street and they're wasting your time. This is a very good form that you can use. It also is a form that people use when you're doing a cash for keys agreement. Maybe you offer your tenants some money in exchange for the keys, so that way you can sell it to an investor or get the completion date that you want. Now, there's also the N12 notice to end the tenancy. This notice is for the buyer's personal use. Now, usually when you sell the property, unless somebody is assuming the tenant, you're gonna use one of those two forms. And it's very important that you fill it out correctly, you serve it correctly, and you also serve it to the landlord and tenant board so you can at least get a hearing date if the tenant still doesn't comply. If you fail to do any of these things, it gets thrown in the garbage and your sale becomes another living nightmare. So these are the forms that you want to use when you're selling your house. Make sure you know them and make sure they're done correctly. Hire a paralegal if you don't know what you're doing. Which leads me to my next point. Make sure you have the right crew to sell your house. The paralegal, somebody who has experience to issue these forms correctly. Make sure they get you a fast hearing date, which in Ontario right now, when you're selling a tenanted property, typically you're looking at about 4 to 5 months from the time you issue that notice. So make sure you have a good paralegal that's gonna issue all those forms correctly. They're gonna fill them out for you correctly. They're gonna serve them to the tenant for you correctly. And they're gonna get that hearing date, which is so important because now the tenant knows you've done everything right, their walls are caving in, they realize they're gonna have to leave, and things become easier for you. The buyer also sees that you have a hearing date, so they're trusting you know what you're doing, and they're confident they're actually gonna get the property with vacant possession, and this gets a lot easier and will have a successful sale. The next thing, the real estate agent. If they've never sold a tenanted property before, please do not hire them. I've seen a lot of landlords lose a ton of money, lose their sale, things fall apart, have to start all over again because the agent doesn't know the landlord-tenant board laws and how to sell a house in Ontario. The clauses and conditions aren't in the offer. They don't serve 24 hours notice properly, don't communicate with the tenant. They say things that are not within the board's guidelines, and it can get really messy and cause you a lot of stress. So if you need a realtor in Ontario, anywhere in Ontario, shoot me a text or give me a call. I'd be happy to help you guys. Now, the last thing that I want to talk to you guys about before you get started, before you do any of these things, it's always best to try to come up with an agreement with the tenant before you even put the property up for sale. Now, I do this a lot The reason for it is because there are things that the tenant can do. For example, they can deny you of interior photos. It's not the end of the world. You can still sell the house, and I've sold plenty of houses when the tenants denied photos. But if they do allow it, that's great. And if you have an agreement with the tenant, for example, you're gonna do something like a cash for keys agreement where they sign an N11 before you put it up for sale, then you already know the date the tenant's gonna move out, you know you have an agreement, and you can sell that house to that investor or anybody that comes to the table that gives you top dollar. You don't have to say, oh, it's an investor, he's paying me the most money, but I can't sell it to him because he's not willing to assume the tenancy, and I lawfully can't evict the tenant because he's an investor. So if you have an agreement, which I recently just did and I've done many times before selling a tenanted property, I get the tenant to sign an N11 to end the tenancy on a specific date. I get them to sign what's called a minutes of settlement that the paralegal drafts up with all of the terms in it before we go to market. Now these terms are, you're to allow us of interior photos. You're to clean up the house and make it look nice for all of the showings. You're not to interfere with any of the showings. All of these things, when you're gonna move out, how you're gonna leave the house in a clean, broom swept condition, everything. And when you guys have this agreement, things become a lot easier, and it's always best the landlord and tenant do work together. Now, what I'm going to tell you though is you do not come to this agreement if the financial amount that they're asking for is astronomical and just doesn't make sense. Never let the tenant control the cash for keys amount. If it is way too high, now of course, if they're super low in rent compared to market value, it's typically going to be a little bit higher than normal. It can just take a little bit more time. But don't get crazy and give them something astronomical that doesn't make sense. Okay? So if you guys are looking to sell your house anywhere in Ontario, feel free to give me a call, shoot me a text, or send me an email. I'll put my information down below in the description as well. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you guys next time.